What does it mean to be called crazy in a crazy world? Listen to Madness Radio, voices and visions from outside mental health. Welcome to Madness Radio. This is your host, Will Hall, and today my guest is Irit Shimrat. Irit is a psychiatric survivor and identifies as an escaped lunatic. She has been active in the psychiatric survivor movement since 1986, when she became editor of the Canadian magazine Phoenix Rising, the voice of the psychiatrist. She co-founded the Ontario Psychiatric Survivors Alliance and is the author of the book Call Me Crazy: Stories from the Mad Movement. So welcome to Madness Radio, Irit Shimrat.
Thank you very much for having me, Will Hall.
Yes, I was joking. You're one of the OGs from the psychiatric survivors movement. That's 1986. That's a long time. You carry a lot of history and you've been staying with it and you're still very much a part of the movement. So it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you very much. It's great to be on the show.
How should we get started? You want to just tell us how you escaped being a lunatic?
So the first time was in 1978. I was 20 years old. My life had fallen apart. I'd been living with my father after my parents' divorce, and my father told me that he was getting married and I couldn't live with him anymore. And my boyfriend dumped me, and the program I was absolutely confident of getting into in university, creative writing program at the university where my father taught, rejected me. And then I took a bunch of acid and went crazy.
A bunch of LSD?
Yes.
Aha. How much is a bunch?
Actually, not a whole lot. Some LSD and went nuts. I didn't mention this in my book, the LSD, because I didn't want people to be down on LSD, which I still like.
Okay. Well, at times they've changed since 1986. LSD is now a psychiatric treatment. So we've come completely full circle with that.
Oh, how I used to wish they would treat me with psychedelics when they were drowning me in Haldol.
Oh, yeah. They haven't come full circle yet.
No.
No, they're not quite that. But when you say you took LSD like as a frustration or desperation or
No. For fun.
For fun. Okay. And then you said you went crazy. So what happened?
I entered another universe, which I later named the Land of Total Magic. And I vividly remember being in the graduate student lounge at the Ross building at York University in North Toronto, the Ross building being where my dad taught. And there was in my mind, perhaps in some reality, perhaps in consensus reality, a band playing, and in a sort of pit, a lower area with seating around it, which was real. And I imagine that the rest of this did not happen in consensus reality. I went up to the piano player and suggested he do something different. And I was, affecting what this musical group was doing and tripping really hard and having a really good time and feeling that I had connected with the music of the spheres. I don't have a sense of how much time went by in between things and during things, but sometime not too long after that, and after I had also been writing all over bathroom walls and ceilings by standing on the toilet with a felt pen, and generally being very weird, I was in the car with my dad coming home from the university, and I said, I can make all the lights green all the way home.
While you were tripping on acid, you were in a car with your dad.
Yeah, I had done the acid, I don't know how many days previous, but I never came down from it.
Ah, okay.
I presume that had to do with the enormous stress that I was under. And it was pretty early in my career as an acid head as well. Anyway, my memory is that the lights were indeed green all the way home, and my father got into a panic. And not too long after that, I imagine, took me to our family doctor, who had a little chat with me and told me I needed to go to the hospital. And so I found myself in the hospital trying to run away from staff before I was even admitted and hiding in the bathroom. But they got me and they did the thing that they do of stripping my clothes off and sticking a needle in my ass and putting me in restraints and putting me in solitary confinement like they do to make people better in the wonderful world of mental health.
You were just in the universe of magic and just having a grand old time tripping. And your dad thought, this is a problem. Let's take you to the doctor. And the doctor, in his wisdom, said, okay, let's put you in the hospital. And you tried to bolt, and then the violence comes down. Did they ask you if you wanted to go to the hospital, or
No, nobody asked me anything at any point.
they just shipped you over there?
I don't know how I physically got there, whether my father took me there or ambulances were involved by that point, as they were many times afterwards. I'm guessing that my dad took me there, and then I kind of looked around at what was happening and knew I didn't want to be there. And so that meant that I had to be forced to be there. So this was in 1978. I was 20 years old, and my memory is that I was given 3 pills of Haldol in a tiny ketchup cup when I went to line up at the nurse's station 4 times a day, 12 pills of Haldol a day. That's my memory. And that's my memory from when I actually remembered it. Now it's a memory, if you know what I mean. But I think that that's true. And that was after I stopped saying, I won't take pills. So it was after I stopped being given needles.
Did you stop tripping at this point?
No, I didn't stop tripping for months. I have a paradoxical reaction to neuroleptics. So I started tripping harder.
Was it still like the magical universe happy?
No. And there was an element of magic. I remember thinking that a drawer in a dresser in my room, did I really have a dresser in my room? Maybe, was full of brightly colored things like Fruit Loops, but they were all infused with psychedelic drugs. So I would eat them as often as I could. I think, at this point, my mind was on escape in a way that it hadn't been when I initially took the acid that sent me away.
So I'm just interested in the state of consciousness that you were in. So you didn't really come down, but you started to have a negative trip. When you say you were still tripping and you kept tripping for months, what was going on in that state? It certainly was psychedelic induced. Were you having really strange visual images? And what was the tripping like that kept going?
I think that from what I remember, the only visual strangeness I remember was thinking that my drawer was full of psychedelic Fruit Loops. I think I was mostly seeing with my eyes what was actually in front of me. At the same time, I was being violently incapacitated by the Haldol. So I was nuts. I wasn't happy anymore. And yeah, I felt desperate and terrified. I think I felt desperate and terrified for a long time before I actually started feeling angry. I often confuse my first and second hospitalization. The first one was in the suburban hospital that was so close to where I lived that I could see what I used to call the chimneys where they burn the mental patients from my mother's apartment balcony when I got out. I spent several months in there because that's how it went then.
In the first admission?
Yeah, and much longer in the second one, which came a year later.
So the first admission, you never really came down, and the Haldol had this paradoxical effect of kind of like keeping you in this weird altered state, except now it's not magical at all. It's way darker.
Yeah, it's become a nightmare.
So you were still in this altered, weird state that's now driven by the Haldol. These were back in the days when they kept people for a long time. 78 it was.
Yeah.
So what was going on in there? Were you trying to get out?
I remember my second incarceration much better than my first one. I do know that in the first one, the mental ward was arranged around a courtyard, or we had access to a courtyard that was sort of internal to the hospital, but outdoors. And there were flowers growing in there. And there was a swing where you could swing with another person. And I had friends in there, other patients, and I used to swing with my girlfriends, as it were. And a thing I did was to pick flowers and eat the petals and think that they were getting me more high. I kept wanting to get more high, though less Haldol.
With flower petals and Fruit Loops?
Yes. I had some good times with my friends. I met a man named Mel Starkman when I was in there, who was a close colleague of Don Weitz's, who is the grandpappy of antipsychiatry in Canada. I remember doing pencil portraits of Mel. For some reason, I could draw when I was nuts. And I had them for a long time and then gave them to him when I met him again decades later. So always when I've been locked up, I've had interesting, good times with fellow inmates. But the Haldol really, really fucked me up, as you can imagine. And I was unhappy and wanting out and physically a mess. And eventually I got out after a few months, I don't know how many months, and immediately went off the drugs.
Why did they keep you so long? You were still in this state and they just kept seeing you doing weird stuff and they said, well, we got to keep her longer.
It was pretty standard to keep people for a long time. I don't know if there was more than one psych ward at that hospital, but if there was, I was on the long-term one. And they weren't seeing me improve. They weren't seeing what they wanted to see, which is that I lie down and shut up, I guess.
But eventually you got out of that.
Eventually I got out. I went mad again.
But your parents, they agreed with the doctors?
Oh, yeah. Thanks for reminding me of my parents, because at one point I actually managed to run away in my hospital pajamas and arrive at my mother's house, which they both lived near each other and near the hospital.
How did you manage to run away?
I don't know. I don't know how. I just found a time when the door was unlocked or something like that. I don't remember the details of it, but I do remember that I arrived at my mother's house and she called my father, and they were both in the same room for the first time since the divorce 5 years earlier, that being remarkable to me. But what they then did when they were both in there was to call the police to have me put back in the hospital. Yeah.
Eventually you got out of the first hospitalization. Then why did you go back in?
I went off the drugs and got very mental again. Eventually, I was sleeping at night in the hospital. So they must have been giving me benzodiazepines as well, because those make me sleep. I guess I went off benzos as well as neuroleptics and became very visibly bonkers and was locked up again in August of 1979.
I'm curious about the bonkers part, because now we don't have LSD as an ingredient and we don't have Haldol.
Oh, we may well have.
Oh, I see. So you got out of the hospital and then you're going off your meds and then you're also back interested in psychedelic.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think I did more LSD and that assisted me in going completely off the deep end again.
Do you think that the wanting to escape and all the stressors that you had been under previously were also playing a factor again in wanting to take more LSD, or what was your interest there?
I hadn't had enough fun for a long time and I wanted to have fun, and LSD was still my idea of fun. It's less so now, but I don't reject it.
So you went bonkers and then your family put you back in?
This time it was August of 1979, and both of my parents were in Israel, I think, and I was behaving weirdly at my mother's apartment where I was staying. Two friends came over and were very concerned about me and shoveled me into a taxi to take me to a hospital. I don't know how I didn't end up back at Branson Hospital, the suburban place I could see from where I lived. I ended up at Mount Sinai Hospital in downtown Toronto. I had done a year of university before I went crazy, and I really wanted to go back to university. I think it was August when I got locked up again, and then September came, but the faculty at York was striking. So I made my father promise that he would have me out of there by the time university was back in session and I could go on to year 2 of university. I really wanted to. He was, of course, unable either to say no or to keep that promise. I mean, technically he could have got me out, but he was scared, horribly frightened by what I had become, and, didn't feel like I would be safe out in the world and so on. So that didn't happen. University started up again without me in it. And I basically never spoke to my father again. And he died in October of that year.
Oh, wow.
And when the social worker told me that my father had died, I assumed that it was an experiment to see how I would react to such a thing, whether I'd have a normal reaction. So I tried to put out a normal reaction, but I didn't realize until another year after, when I was locked up somewhere else, that my father had actually died.
Because you were in the hospital when they told you that he had.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
I'm going to skip to the future, a cute story about that, because in the hospital I finally escaped from in 1980, I told my psychiatrist that I had been told that my dad had died, but didn't actually realize that it was true until I got to this other hospital, which was in the States. And that when I realized that my father was dead, I said to him, I just howled. His response was, I didn't realize you were psychotic when you were admitted.
Meaning what?
Nice, huh? Meaning that if somebody howls, they're psychotic.
Ah,
Animals howl, animals and psychotics, not, people.
so you howled because you're realizing that your father died, and now your doctor just says, okay, you're psychotic.
Yeah. He said, I didn't realize you were psychotic when you were admitted, because it was obvious that I wasn't psychotic when I was talking to him. I should probably go back to chronology here. At Mount Sinai, I had a doctor. I would have liked her, except she was making me take stelazine and then Nozanan, two more old-fashioned neuroleptics. The drugs were really, really fucking me up. I don't know how long I was at Mount Sinai before I stopped being crazy. But again, they were giving me Valium. And so I was sleeping, and I did stop being crazy after a time, even though they were still giving me neuroleptics. And many months into my incarceration at Mount Sinai, I said to a doctor, the drugs you're giving me aren't doing me any good, and I don't feel like I need them. I would like you to take me off them. And I believe she tapered me. And I know that towards the end of my stay at that hospital, when I got in the lineup for the ketchup cup full of pills with everybody else, the only pill in my ketchup cup was a birth control pill.
Oh,
Yeah, because I had Valium PRN, but the only thing I took every day was a birth control pill. I also always made sure to get laid at least once at every hospital I was ever at. So my father died. There was actually a memorial service for him in the chapel of the hospital, attended by other family members. And still, I thought it was all fake to see what I was going to do. And then because I had been off neuroleptics for a while, my despair completely transformed into furious anger at being locked up. I got into all kinds of delightful adventures with fellow inmates and so on and so forth. But I also started acting up or acting out. Notably, I set fire to some paper in a metal garbage can in the middle of a room, and was then deemed a pyromaniac and told that they couldn't keep pyromaniacs in this hospital, so they're going to send me somewhere else.
do you remember why you set the fire?
For fun, to be a brat, for fun. I like fire. I want to see some fire. I'm going to do it safely. I don't know how I had anything to light anything with. We were all frantic cigarette smokers, but we weren't allowed to have lighters on us. But somehow I did that. Presumably smuggled a pack of matches or something. Anyway, as far as I can reconstruct things, my father had died. He had left an amount of money for me and my brother. My brother took charge of all the money. Part of that money was used to ship me to a hospital in Bethesda, Maryland.
Oh, okay.
So when I was told that I wasn't going to be staying at Mount Sinai, but I would still have to be in hospital, they said they were going to send me somewhere in California. And I said, that sounds fantastic. Let's do that. But then I ended up in Maryland.
In the pyromaniac wing of the...
No, I ended up in a low security building at the Shepherd Pratt Looney Bin in Towson, actually, next to Bethesda, but it was quite close to Johns Hopkins. I got there, I think, in June of 1980. Oh, I skipped an important part. When I was locked up at Mount Sinai, and I had just turned 22, so it was April of 1980. I'd been in there all that time. They sent me to a group home called Regeneration House, which I instantly named Degeneration House, and where everybody else was a complete zombie on neuroleptic. I think I got to see the house once before they shipped me there. And they shipped me there with 2 paper bags, one with 100 stelazine in it, a neuroleptic, and one with 100 imipramine in it, a tricyclic antidepressant. I'd never taken antidepressants. But the day I got there, I took all 200 pills with some Haagen-Dazs chocolate ice cream, because it was clear to me that the rest of my life was going to be shuttling back and forth, being shuttled back and forth between hospital and group homes, and that wasn't going to be a life. So I tried to kill myself. And that's the only time in my life that I seriously, earnestly tried to kill myself. But I was too eager, and I didn't wait until after supper. I would have got away with it, but I couldn't wait. And I went upstairs with my pills and my ice cream and some water. And my roommate came up to call me down to dinner, found me unconscious and convulsing, and they put me back in Mount Sinai, pumped my stomach, and the beat went on. So it was after that, in the summer, I guess, that I got feisty enough to be starting a fire in a garbage can. And then I think it was June that they sent me to this place in Maryland, which was quite great as mental hospitals go. It was low security, and I think the ward I was on was periodically locked, but maybe not locked all the time. And we had a million activities. And even though they were called therapy of various kinds, they were good activities. Now, when I was in Mount Sinai, one of my ward mates was a young woman, a beautiful young woman, very talented cellist who had her cello at the hospital and used to play it for us sometimes. She had gone into the hospital after having been raped and getting, I guess, a little upset about being raped. So they decided she was mentally ill. And one of the orderlies was raping her regularly in the hospital. And all Penny wanted was to die. I get it.
Yeah.
And my fondest memory and my only clear memory of Penny herself in particular, other than that she was beautiful and a good cellist, was that she once gave me a pill called Imovane. I understand it's in the category of both benzodiazepines and something called hypnotics.
So older, really older.
Yeah, I think its newer incarnation is Zopiclone. Penny said she would give me one of her Imovanes, which I understood gave a person a buzz, and she transferred it to my mouth from her mouth. So that was like sexy. And I did get a buzz off it, and that was great. So then I'm in the hospital in Maryland, and a nurse comes in and tells me that she has something terrible to tell me, which is that my friend Penny from at Mount Sinai has died. And she said, if you don't want to go to activities today, you don't have to. And even though activities were good, I also really liked just staying in bed. So I just stayed in bed that day and was happy for Penny that she had finally gotten out.
Did she kill herself?
Yes. And I found out later from somebody who'd been locked up with us both that she had taken no chances. She had taken an overdose, drank a bunch of drink, and then got into the bathtub with an electrical appliance. So that girl knew what she was doing. And I was just happy for her. I understood completely how her life felt to her and that she needed out.
Yeah. Although, it was the psychiatry that killed her.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, of course. Several of my co-inmates at Mount Sinai killed themselves. I, for a long time, remembered and I think mentioned in my book the first names of 3 of them. I had a pretty good time at Shepherd Pratt. I had a lover there. He was very, very sweet. And there were fun things to do, and the food was okay. And yet I was always plotting my departure.
Your departure, your killing yourself or your escape?
My escape. No more thought of killing myself. My escape. So at this point, there had been some money from the inheritance from my dad, and I was being given an allowance by a lawyer. And so I was sent an amount of money. Somehow I was receiving cash at the nursing station every week or month or something. And I put all that money under my mattress. Didn't need money for anything. I also started a diary at that point, which I think I still have somewhere. I'd never kept a diary before. I had studied classical Greek in high school, and I wrote my diary in the Greek alphabet. It was in English, but I transliterated it into Greek. And I remember my boyfriend looking at it. I guess there was a library somewhere, and he got hold of something that allowed him to translate my diary, which I thought was genius. I thought that was so cool. Anyway, I still write in Greek sometimes when I want to write something I don't want anybody to read. That is not in Greek, but in English and Greek, with little modifications for letters that don't correspond. So one day I had enough money to get out of there. And I told my boyfriend and my other 2 friends who I was close with that I was going to hightail it and that I was going by airplane. And then I went to the bus station. And I found out later that there was an all points bulletin for me in Maryland, but by that time I was in another state. And I arrived in Toronto, and I arrived at my mother's door, and my mother was dreadfully alarmed, though glad to see me. She wanted to call the hospital. And it wasn't very long before I said, okay, call them and I'll go back there, but only if I can go back to the same ward I was in, because I did not like living with my mother. It was not working out. She called them and she said, no, they can't tell me which ward you're going to be on. I said, then I'm not going. And I didn't go. Oh, I missed a very important part here. On my way on the bus from Maryland to Toronto, I sat down beside a young man who asked me, what I did. And I said, I'm an escaped lunatic. And he got up and sat somewhere else. I still love that about myself, that I said that.
What is it that you love? I can imagine, but what is it that you love about having said that?
It's so weird and so bold, and who would ever call themselves that? And that's exactly what I was.
There's a certain power and confidence and freedom in it, I guess.
Yeah. I just thought I was hilarious, and I still think I was hilarious. So I got a place to live in a boarding house, not a psychiatric boarding house, a human boarding house, and moved downtown. I've always loved downtown.
And how old are you now?
I'm 22.
Did you go back in the system after this, or you were escaped now?
I was then 18 years free. I didn't go back till I was 40.
Aha. Okay. Just looking back on that whole time, you're 20, you're 22. What did you need? I mean, other than just not locking you up, I mean, what is it that you felt like maybe would have been helpful for someone who is not coming down from an LSD trip?
Playmates, gentle encouragement to eat and sleep.
So part of not coming down was also not sleeping.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. Every time I've been crazy, it has started with many nights of not sleeping at all.
It's a very recurring theme for a lot of people.
For sure.
Did they ever talk to you about sleep in the hospital?
No. They just knocked me out. They didn't talk to me about stuff.
So same as it is now, no real discussion about how to understand or navigate the states. It's take the meds, you're crazy.
Yeah. There's no real discussion of any kind. There's no therapy. I hate therapy anyway, but there wasn't any. Everything is just about whether they think you're responding to your drugs the way you're supposed to be. Now, I remembered another important thing, which is that when I was at Mount Sinai and not responding to drugs the way they wanted me to, Dr. Bukhari asked my mother for permission to give me electroshock, and my mother said no.
Oh, thank you, Mom.
Yes. Very, very nice. Yeah.
Were you a minor at that point, or why were they asking your mom?
Because I wasn't considered a person, I guess. I would have been 21, so no way I would have been a minor.
Right, but the laws weren't in effect where they actually ask you, which is usually how it's done now.
Yeah, I don't know that anyone gets asked as such. See, I think the laws that are in place now to protect people don't at all whatsoever.
I would agree with that. I mean, they asked me, they wanted my consent, and this is in San Francisco. But of course, it was very deceitful. They gave me some research about the safety of ECT and the effectiveness. And I didn't understand what was going on. I was just reading this material, and it occurred to me, they say that, it has extremely low danger rate, but general anesthesia is involved. And it just was a logical question, like, well, if you're telling me that there's no risk, I know that there's risk in general anesthesia. Why is that not included in the conversation here?
Yeah.
They wouldn't answer that. They wouldn't even respond to my logical. And fortunately, my dad was discouraging me because he had been multiple times electroshocked in the psychiatric hospital. And then I think I just had a very lucky situation because there was a social worker who I think was moving things behind the scenes because they came and told me that the insurance had run out. And then they discharged me instead of electroshocking me because I was so completely disorganized and psychotic and unable to take care of myself and unresponsive. Suddenly I'm qualified to just kick out on the streets and put into a homeless shelter. So, but they did ask me for my consent as uninformed consent, let's say.
Exactly. This is a big bee in my bonnet and always will be, that informed consent is a complete fraud because they never give you the actual information. Because if they did, everyone would just say no to everything.
That's right. So looking back, you have taken a lot of antipsychotics. Do you have persistent, lingering impairment or after effects or anything like that?
No.
I'm glad to hear that.
Thank you. Yeah, it's very lucky. I mean, I had an awful lot of neuroleptics in 1978 and 1979.
Yeah. It just seems like it's a roll of the dice. I haven't seen any pattern to who gets long-term damage and who has long-term even withdrawal effects. And the research that I'm involved in, I don't see any patterns. It really just seems like a roll of the dice. You would think that the folks that have long-term and high dosage, but you had long-term and it sounds like pretty high dosage.
Yeah, but I think a lot of the people who have permanent effects, their long term was way longer than my long term. My long term was only a couple of years with an interruption in the middle of it.
I just met somebody a couple of days ago who's been on antipsychotics for less than a year and has a visible tardive dyskinesia.
I had dyskinesia, not tardive. I think one can only fairly call it tardive if it happens after you're off. But I had dyskinesia really bad, both in my early incarcerations and in the later ones in my part of the world. But it went away not too long after getting off the drugs each time, which is extraordinarily lucky.
I had a long period where I couldn't read and I couldn't focus, but I was so disoriented that I didn't even kind of realize that it was happening. I never really sort of questioned it. I was really in a daze for years around the time that I was in the hospitals. And it did eventually come back, but I mean, I'll probably never know exactly what happened, but I do think I have some very small cognitive impairments, some memory issues. Like I can get
Yeah.
kind of forgetful sometimes, where people will tell me, oh, you already told me that, or don't you remember? And or they'll remember things that we did together that I don't remember. And that very well could be related to antipsychotics. And I was on antipsychotics, I guess, for a couple of years.
Yeah, like me, pretty much. In between the two long hospitalizations, in the suburban hospital and the downtown hospital in Toronto, I tried to go back to school. I tried to go to the University of Toronto and take Eastern philosophy
Oh,
because I had read something to do with that before I got locked up and was interested in it, but I couldn't read. The words kind of melted on the page and I couldn't concentrate and it didn't work out.
you weren't taking neuroleptics at that time, but you were having the after effects that eventually got better.
Yeah, it was in between bouts of huge amounts of neuroleptization, and the fog stayed with me for a while. I also took a French course and aced it. I took a second year university French course, and that I could do.
Yeah, maybe it's just selective in the brain. I used to be able to do math pretty well, and that was completely wiped out. I'm hopeless with math now after being in the psychiatric system.
So I used to be able to write fiction, and those early psychiatrizations killed that.
Oh, wow. And you were actually hoping to be in a creative writing program.
I was certain that I would be a successful novelist. I was certain of that from junior high school.
When you say wipe it out, like you no longer had inspiration or you weren't flowing with the writing or
I couldn't write fiction. I didn't have ideas about stories. As soon as Phoenix Rising happened in my life, as soon as I met Don Weitz and I became an editor and an activist, I couldn't and didn't want to write about anything except psychiatry.
that's criminal. That's a criminal injury that happened to you.
All of it is criminal.
That's right. And it's not talked about. Just that one thing of losing a creative talent. That should be disqualifying for any prescription of these drugs. I mean, that is horrific. That's horrific.
There are a billion things that should be disqualifying. And I also lost about 90% of the memory of my life before those psychiatrizations, my life before 20.
Did those memories ever come back or not?
Shards of them came back, but not solid blocks of time.
But you didn't do the electroshock. This was just from the antipsychotics, neuroleptics.
Yeah, yeah. And my short-term memory is also terrible, and I used to attribute that to long-lasting, lingering after effects of neuroleptics, but then I had to admit to myself that I smoke a lot of pot and that I'm old.
Yeah, it's hard to tease these apart. I mean, I also had mercury fillings, and I kind of wonder whether that was related to it. So let's get back to the story. So you went for a long period after coming out and you wanted to go back to school.
No, I wanted to go back to school in between the two long Toronto hospitalizations.
Okay.
By the time I got out of Towson, I didn't want to anymore. And I got this room in a rooming house and I loved it. I loved living by myself. I loved living downtown and I decorated it. I had this bedspread from my room at my father's house that was very intense, deep colors in a flower pattern. And I reproduced that on pieces of paper that I would then stick around various places in my room. Oh, and I spent a lot of time doing colored felt pen drawings. I went through a big creative phase and really, really enjoyed that. And I still have all of those, and some of them are pretty funny because I did some cartoon ones too. After some time, a dear friend who was one of the people who helped me get into the bin against my will, but like other people in my life, is now a dear friend again, got me a job. He was working at City Hall in Toronto doing sort of clerk stuff, and he got me a job doing that as well. And I was able to do it, and it was okay. But I wasn't real happy. One of the things that happened, in between hospitalizations, those early first ones, was I became lovers with a woman and decided that I was gay and that had been why I'd ever had problems. And when I was working at City Hall, I was with another woman for a while, and then a third woman who I ended up breaking up with. And that was about recreational drugs. We had gone to a movie at a repertory theater, and I had done some bad acid, and I was looking at myself in the mirror in the bathroom at the theater, and my face was melting or whatever, and I was freaking out. And this man had been chatting us up and said that he had some pot at his house. So I said to my girlfriend, let's go to his house and smoke some pot. She said, okay.
Acid plus weed, not a good combo.
Well, at 3 a.m, she said, okay, let's go home now. And I said, no, I want to smoke more pot. So she dumped me. She left and didn't want to be my girlfriend anymore, very understandably. And the fellow assumed that I wanted to be his lover, which I didn't, but I did that anyway because I was really interested in the pot. And so I was with that guy for a few years, and I was working. I had temporary secretary jobs for the City Hall and then other places, but I was doing what now gets called self-harm. I was pulling my hair sometimes out and biting myself really hard because I was unhappy.
But you must have been extremely unhappy and maybe felt like there was no way out, or how did the unhappiness lead to the so-called self-harm, do you think?
I was not unhappy all the time. I was kind of intermittently unhappy, but I was very unhappy in my relationship, even though he was a nice boy. It wasn't a happy thing for me at all. I would cry after sex privately. That was the only time in my life I saw a therapist voluntarily. And he was a practitioner of neurolinguistic programming. He was a darling, darling man. He said he could cure me in 3 sessions of my depression.
Oh, how did that turn out?
When that didn't work, he said, I'll continue to see you and you don't have to pay me anything. And I saw him for, I don't know if it was weeks or months, and he did wackadoo things. He once hung me by my ankles upside down from a tree and swung me gently back and forth because we knew I had a thing about breathing and that I would hold my breath when I get upset, which I still do.
What year is this? Because it sounds like this is the heights of therapy weirdness era, early 80s.
This would have been in the early 80s. Yep. I was smoking like 3 packs a day of cigarettes. We agreed that he would wrap up a pack of cigarettes for me and keep it at his house so that I wouldn't smoke because I wanted to quit. And on New Year's Eve, I called him. I was at a bar with a woman, an ex-lover of mine, and she was kind of blowing cigarette smoke in my face across the table. And I called the therapist and I said, I want those cigarettes. I want them right now. It was New Year's Eve. He was celebrating with his girlfriend. He had me come over to his house. We unwrapped the cigarettes from the 40 layers of masking tape, and he wrecked his New Year's Eve for me. He was a very dear man. His primary therapeutic mode with me was to have me imagine that I was going down an escalator from a red room to an orange room to a yellow room to a green room to a blue room, with blue being my calming color. And I used to pretend to get hypnotized to make him happy, but I'm unfortunately, very unfortunately, not hypnotizable.
Well, why weren't you able to just go out and get cigarettes yourself? Why was it that you had to get them from him and then unwrap them?
That must have been some kind of mishigas on my part. That must have been some weird thinking that I couldn't just go and buy cigarettes. Maybe I didn't have a lot of money and I thought, well, I have a pack of cigarettes, but he's got it. Anyway, I don't know the answer to that. It was a while longer before I decided to stop seeing him because it just wasn't working. Oh, and one of the other things he did was his girlfriend was a nurse and he had me in his office or in a hospital office smoke pot in the presence of him and his girlfriend to see if that could be used therapeutically. Boy, it was not a great experience. It took all the fun out of pot smoking. But he went to great lengths to try and help me, and he was just a really sweet, sweet man.
And saw you for free.
And saw me for free many times.
But it wasn't ultimately helpful.
Oh, God, no. At some point, I started hanging out with Chris Burchill, who was a famous lesbian in Toronto. This was while I was still living with this guy. I went to community college for book editing and design. And my boyfriend was highly amused and aroused by the idea of watching girls doing it together. I started flirting with girls in my class, and I had something resembling sex with a couple of them, in one case in his presence. And I had said earlier that it was earlier, but that's when I decided, oh, I'm a lesbian. That's my problem. The problem is that I've been trying to be a straight person, but I'm a dyke. In 1984, December, I moved in with Chris Burchill.
The famous lesbian from Toronto.
The famous lesbian in a communal queer house in downtown Toronto, one piece of a Victorian triplex, very close to Lake Ontario.
And until now, you're not connected with the psychiatric survivor movement or doing MAD activism.
That's right. That's coming right up. I was happy. I was in a great relationship. I was doing lots of fun drugs.
Did that stick, the idea that your big problem was just not embracing being gay? Or was that just a hypothesis at that time that made sense?
That was a hypothesis at the time that made sense. I do think that having been born and raised female was a great contributor to my lack of self-esteem, my self-loathing, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, mental patient multiplies that.
And most of the patients were women? I think historically it's mostly women that get thrown in, yeah?
That may be the case. I don't remember the answer to that. Anyway, I became friends with Chris's friends, and one of her friends found an ad somewhere, a classified ad for something called Phoenix Rising, the Voice of the Psychiatrist, looking for an editor. And I had done my editing course in community college, and I met Don Weitz, and I was hired within about 3 seconds.
But you found the MAD movement through a classified ad.
Yes. That somebody else found. It wasn't even me who found the ad. And I had not a clue that there was another person on the planet Earth who believed that psychiatry was a crock of shit. And suddenly there was Don Weitz, and there was Phoenix Rising, and there were all these people writing for it and doing art for it and so on.
So Phoenix Rising is sort of the Canadian counterpart to Madness Network News.
That's right.
And back then, there's no internet, there's no email. I mean, it is the underground press. The movements are based on magazines and sending stuff through the mail and bookstores. And
Yep.
You got to the center of the center of the center of the MAD movement in Canada by getting connected with Phoenix Rising.
Yeah. I really found myself editing Phoenix Rising because I adore editing and I'm very, very good at it. I was doing what meant something to me, which is lessening the suffering and increasing the joy of other psychiatrized people.
So what kind of stuff is in Phoenix Rising, just for people who've never seen it or don't really know?
It's online and people should check it out.
Yeah, they should. But just give us some examples. What kinds of articles? What was the MAD movement up to? What kinds of things were people doing?
So there were sections. There was Phoenix Feather and Turkey Tail, where we would give somebody an award for doing something good and a thumbs down for doing something bad. And there was a legal section about, laws concerning mental health. And there was a huge creative writing section, and there was lots of art, and there was poetry. And there was an electroshock section. At the back, there'd be like a whole inside back cover listing shock doctors in Canada and stuff like that.
Names and addresses, basically doxing, the early days of doxing.
Yeah, I don't know if it was addresses, but names is important, right?
You're also doing a lot of protests, yeah?
Yeah, Dawn was really into protests. We would protest in front of various hospitals with a handful of people. Occasionally, there'd be, a little bit more than a handful. And I remember demonstrating outside of the Clark Institute of Psychiatry, which was a major shock mill, and one of the great proponents of electroshock coming out and screaming at us that we were endangering people's lives by putting them off electroshock.
War is peace, ignorance is strength. Yes.
Yes. So Chris Burchell, who is the greatest person I've ever met in a life full of meeting great people, was the designer of Phoenix Rising.
This was your girlfriend, the famous lesbian.
Yeah, yeah, my lover. She did some of the design on Phoenix Rising. She was not a psychiatric survivor. She had way more reason with the childhood that she had to have gone mad than I did, but she never did go mad. She wasn't the type.
But the gay liberation movement at this time was very critical of psychiatry because homophobia and the diseasification of sexual minorities.
Yeah, and homosexuality having recently been a diagnosis in the DSM. So actually, the very last issue of Phoenix Rising, which came out in 1990, was the gay and lesbian issue. I'm so proud of it still. It's a fantastic thing. And all of the issues can be read entirely online.
I think if you go to the Madness Network News website, also Phoenix Rising is there. Yeah.
And so is psychiatrize.org. Jim Gottstein's also in Alaska. And now it's on the Dawn White's Legacy Project webpage.
Great. Great. So the lesbian and gay issue was, you're really proud of that.
For many reasons. It was the most beautiful issue physically, I think. But I also got the stories of a lot of my friends who were gay and psychiatrized. I hadn't even known had been psychiatrized. It was just huge, huge fun. And then the magazine folded, but then not too long after that, I had a couple of nationally broadcast radio shows, one called Analyzing Psychiatry and the other By Reason of Insanity. So one about psychiatry itself and one about forensic psychiatry.
Why did Phoenix Rising fold?
Money. We were getting funding issue by issue. And, those of us who were working on it full time were not very many of us and making a very, very small amount of money.
And you're not getting a lot of pharmaceutical advertisements.
No, it nobly ran for 10 years from 1980 until 1990. So my radio shows were in 90 and 91, and they got huge reactions and were rebroadcast a bunch of times on CBC, the national radio. Unfortunately, they are no longer in the archives. They don't keep the archives that long, I guess. But somewhere I have a transcript and an actual CD of my show, and also my show on cassette tape. They stand up. They're very, very good. In no small measure because my dear friend Max Allen, who worked at CBC Radio, did a phenomenal job editing and producing those shows.
Let's try and get those online so people can listen to them.
Definitely. Yes. Yes. When I first gave him the script I originally wrote, he looked at it and he said, yeah, this isn't a radio show. This is a magazine. So he rewrote it. He turned things around so that it made sense as a radio show. And it's very, very good. I remember analyzing psychiatry in particular with fondness. I interviewed a lot of cool people for analyzing psychiatry, psychiatric survivors, and a couple of dissident practitioners and others. Around the same time as the first radio show, and in the same year that Phoenix folded, I and some other people founded the Ontario Psychiatric Survivors Alliance. And we got $1 million from the provincial government to fight the provincial government.
Holy smokes.
We got it from the mental health ministry.
$1 million.
Yeah.
Wow.
The staff of the provincial office were me and Randy Pritchard, the late Randy Pritchard, who is a survivor of forensic treatment in Canada.
Does the getting the grant of that size reflect that the politics had changed, that there was enough popularity of the psychiatric survivor movement, that there was enough media attention, that the politicians kind of saw that, okay, the ground is shifting?
It was a time when there was a realization by the powers that be that we have to pretend to have partnership and consumer participation in order to keep this charade of help going.
I'm also imagining it was a time before the more mainstream pharma doctor aligned pseudo patient groups had actually been formed to create a pushback.
Yeah, that's right.
You were the only ones that were kind of raising the issues, so you were the ones that they had to cooperate with to some degree.
They were actively looking for some big consumer participation thing they could do. Randy and I were it.
Yeah.
We had brilliant ideas. He was the behind the scenes budget person, and I was the flying around, enjoying a lot of public speaking person.
But I imagine with your radical politics and staying true to the cause, that was kind of a honeymoon period that didn't last.
The thing lasted for 2 years, and we had to have a board of directors, and we had to have consumers on our board of directors. And there were people on our board of directors who thought we were criminally insane for, even using the word psychiatric survivor. There was that going to bring it down at some point anyway. And then there was increasing pressure from our funders to be more conservative. And then there were personal dynamics between me and Randy. And together, all of those things meant that the whole thing exploded after 2 years, but we did a lot in those 2 years. Traveling all over the province, starting groups, helping people start independent groups. We would go to mental health clubhouses and say, you could meet without staff.
What years was this?
1991 and 92. We would actually go to Canadian Mental Health Association clubhouses and kick the staff out. And they would take that. I don't know why. And meet just with the victims of services.
For the purposes of the meetings.
Yeah, of course. But that meant that we got to talk frankly, and the people got to talk frankly, the clubhouse members. We had the Randy and Irit show, which we did all over the province, was quite a riot. I was the soft cop and he was the hard cop.
You were the soft cop.
Yes. Oh, yes. We once went to a conference where we were talking to a room full of mental health professionals, and he said to them, if you are not working to put yourselves out of a job, you are not doing good things. I was the soft cop, but we would tell our personal stories, and we would say, I was half dead on psych drugs and just wanted to die. And look at me now. I've got a job. I'm here. I'm doing things that mean something to me. And people were really inspired.
And not taking meds.
Yes, exactly. And we spoke very frankly, as you can imagine, about the meds and about electroshock and everything else.
Yeah, just the power of truth telling. I mean, I've done quite a lot of that, and people are sort of shocked, and people are really surprised to hear the truth, because the whole industry is based on not listening to people and not facing the realities of people's lives. So just going in and just telling a story about your own experience can have huge implications for people. They've never been exposed to it before.
Absolutely. It was a good time, those 2 years. It was a lot of fun, and we did a lot of good. And some of the groups that we started, 1 or 2 of them are still going in some guys, though not radical anymore. But we did radicalize a lot of people, and we helped a lot of people sort of see the light of, maybe I don't have to just keep taking pills and hiding in my room and then going to the clubhouse and drinking coffee and smoking cigarettes, and that's my whole life.
So when you say radical, like how radical? How would you encapsulate your own politics? Are you just an abolitionist, get rid of the meds? What are your politics around psychiatry?
My politics around psychiatry are that psychiatry is an absolute crock of shit. Everything about it is fraudulent and pernicious and very, very dangerous. I hang out with people who are abolitionists. I don't believe that psychiatry can be abolished, but I do believe that if enough people put forth enough truth and enough ideas about what you can do to actually feel better, that psychiatry will atrophy.
Okay, and other aspects of like banning electroshock, for example, what would you do about the drugs or the pharmaceutical industry? Or
I'd love to have electroshock and neuroleptics and antidepressants banned, but that's not going to happen.
What about forced treatment?
Of course, forced treatment should be banned.
So I think abolitionists, when we talk about, because I identify as a psychiatric abolitionist, I think that's the core of it. We want to get rid of any legal basis for discriminating between people's rights based on a psychiatric diagnosis.
Thank you for mentioning discrimination, because Canada has signed and ratified, and the US may have signed but not ratified, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities.
The CRPD, yeah. The US has not signed it or ratified.
Well, it figures, and Canada's signing of it is meaningless and would have been meaningless anyway, but they also declared an exception to Article 12, which is the one that confers personhood upon a person. It's the one about legal capacity. and the right to make your own decisions. So Canada has signed and ratified the convention, but with a stated exclusion of the core provision. And so it's all bullshit. It's all complete bullshit. And I've been working in all kinds of ways on the CRPD for years now. I've heard that good things are happening in Mexico and one other place. I haven't really followed up on that much because I'm more preoccupied with the bad things that have never changed and aren't going to change in the foreseeable future that are happening everywhere else, and especially here for me in this context being North America.
So let's get back. Just how did you end up, after being involved with the MAD movement, how did you end up going back into a psych hospital, even after forming those relationships, having those connections, being part of the movement and strengthening your anti-psychiatry perspective? How did that happen that you ended up back in the system?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. When OPSA, the Ontario Psychiatric Survivors Alliance, exploded, I moved to Vancouver. I left Ontario altogether and moved to Vancouver. My grandfather had died and left me a bit of money, so I was financially able to do that and didn't have to work right away. I got temp work again pretty quickly and was having a pretty good life. And then I got involved with a wonderful man who was 14 years younger than me and into all kinds of drugs. And I took all kinds of drugs with him and went nuts on drugs again and got locked up again. I couldn't believe that this had happened to me because, as you just said, here I was with all this supposed protection of a movement, da-da-da-da-da.
How did it happen? You were taking drugs, you were really high, and you were just in public and you got grabbed by police, or did your partner call services, or what happened?
There were a few occasions. I'm not even sure if I can remember very clearly the initial one when I was 40. It was a question of me going very mental and behaving very weirdly and people getting scared for me more than of me.
Did you stop sleeping as well?
Oh yeah, always, always, always. That's always the number one thing. I stopped eating and I stopped sleeping and I lost a lot of weight and I looked at myself in the mirror and thought, I like my body for the first time ever. And I was really skinny.
Were you back in magic universe land, that realm that you had discovered?
Yeah, it was a different though. It was different though. It was already different by the second time because I'd had the bad experience of being locked up and psychiatrized. So there were ominous elements. Unlike my initial craziness, every craziness after that has increasingly had frightening, horrific elements.
Yeah, a lot of people say that the wild visionary state is very positive until the reactions of other people start getting into the mix. And that's when it starts to get darker.
Yeah. The big bang in my 40s came when I had this terrific apartment in a wonderful, wonderful area of the city. And I started throwing stuff out my window into the dumpster below and making a lot of noise. And I, at one point, was going up and down the halls of my building naked, pounding on people's doors and yelling emergency. Not smart. My building superintendent, with whom I had been friends, at one point in there said, "You want to go for a ride in my car?" And I said, "Sure." And she took me to the University of British Columbia Psych Hospital, had me admitted. And while I was in there, unconscious, I was evicted. Oh, another good part. The story of my recent psychiatrizations and my subsequent life as a mental patient and getting out of that is one I haven't written yet, which is a bloody shame because it is hilarious.
Tell us the highlights.
Before that eviction and incarceration, which happened a couple of years after a series of very short incarcerations, a long weekend, somehow it would always be a fucking weekend. And so the psychiatrist wouldn't be there to release me until Tuesday. But then I had a couple of 6 weeks ones. Just prior to the 6-week one during which I was evicted, I had lost my job. My job had been doing clerical work for the Mental Health Advocate of British Columbia. I would be transcribing, stuff that was heartbreaking and seeing how much she really wasn't helping, even though she would really like to help, and how she didn't really get the point, even though, she wasn't dumb. One of the grand precipitating incidents and one of my shorter incarcerations that ended up with a longer one after was when I went to pick up my paycheck at the office And I was tearing up my paycheck while taking off my clothes, while going up the spiral staircase in the beautiful Dominion building in downtown Vancouver, where the office was. Don't know what I would have done if I got to the top of the staircase, but the mental health advocate had her secretary call the cops, of course. I was taken away in handcuffs.
What was going on in your head while you were doing this? Was it a meaningful?
Oh, always the extremely insane things I do when I'm about to get locked up have deep, deep meaning for me. Another thing that I would often do, it always involved taking off my clothes. I would also cut up my ID and throw out my keys and throw out my contact lenses. In this case, I was viscerally rejecting, symbolically and dramatically rejecting that job and the idea that mental health advocacy, as rendered, was a useful thing. And always when this happens, I'm rejecting some aspect of my own identity, I think. But I think I was mad at the job and I was mad at the advocate. And on that trip to the hospital, they cuffed my hands behind my back and then had me, lying down on top of all that in the ambulance. It was very painful. I was taken to one of the hospitals in town where I had been locked up before or would be locked up or whatever. Again, it was just a long weekend because I knew what to say to get out, which is yes, thank you. Yes, please, drugs. Yes. I'll see the team. I'll see the mental health team. Yes. Anyway, the nurse who injected me on that occasion with Haldol, I think, although I might have made that up, but I kind of think it was Haldol. I think she told me so. And I hadn't had Haldol since I was 20. Jabbed me so hard with the needle that I still have a welt from it. So a week after that injection, when I was back at home, lying in bed, I relaxed physically for the first time, and my knee came up and hit my forehead.
Wait, what do you mean you relaxed physically? You mean that from the drugs?
I just was drugged for the weekend that I was in. I never take drugs once I'm out. But I was so tense and up from that experience and the drugging that, I had some kind of inner paralysis thing. And when that let go, I had this neurological reaction. That was one of the brief incarcerations. And then I think not too long after that, my sense of time is all mushed up about this, is when my building superintendent quite rightly got me out of there and locked up. I haven't all my life sympathized with the people who got me incarcerated and drugged.
Yeah. Why do you say quite rightly?
I do. I sympathize with my mother and with my father and with my friends who got me to Mount Sinai in Toronto and with my building superintendent who had me put away and removed from the building because I was being impossible. And there isn't anything else in our society to do with people who are being impossible. I had to be dealt with, and people did what they knew was right. And it wasn't right, but they had no way of knowing that. During the 6 weeks that I was at UBC, University of British Columbia Hospital, which was a rather amusing hospital as they go. They were very interesting social milieu and a great smoking room, terribly smelly, but we would all be in the smoking room at 4:00 in the morning, out of sight of staff, being very social and having a good time. Before I was released into the general population of the ward, while I was still in the dungeon unconscious, a social worker put me on disability without me having to lift a finger. And I've been on disability ever since, until just now when I got an old age pension, because that's what happens. You age out of disability into old age pension. It was difficult for me very briefly knowing I was on a pension for a disease that wasn't real. I felt like a fraud. But then at some point I realized that this was, though not intentionally, reparations. The state had taken away my freedom and my abilities and everything that was important in my life. And now I'm getting paid. Good. I should be. We all should be. In fact, I think there should be a basic livable income for everybody everywhere.
Yeah.
And then rid of so many problems, including a lot of so-called mental illness.
We are just about out of time. Tell people how they can find out more and also maybe read your book if they want to.
I would like very much for people to go to the Don White's Legacy Project to find out about Don White's, and it includes some of the stuff I did with him, but he's so important and he unfortunately died last year. So check out the Don White's Legacy Project, those words, DONWEITZ. And also you can buy my book used online, but you can read it, download it and print it, or else just read it on screen at Madness Canada. And if you just Google Call Me Crazy Madness Canada, you will find it.
Irit Shimrat, thank you for joining us on Madness Radio.
Very much my pleasure, Will. Thanks so much for having me. This has been a blast.
You've been listening to an interview with Irit Shimrat. She is a psychiatric survivor and identifies as an escaped lunatic. She's been active in the psychiatric survivor movement since 1986, when she became editor of the Canadian magazine Phoenix Rising, The Voice of the Psychiatrized. She co-founded the Ontario Psychiatric Survivors Alliance and is the author of the book Call Me Crazy: Stories from the Mad Movement. Thanks for joining us today on Madness Radio. What does it mean to be called crazy in a crazy world? Listen to Madness Radio, voices and visions from outside mental health.